This court explainer is from CassianCreed.com. This explainer details the legal test, who carries the burden of proof, how both sides interpret the evidence, and why medical evidence does not automatically decide criminal responsibility.
To really understand what's unfolding in the courtroom, here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the case status and dispute, the legal test and burden, interpreting the evidence, medical context versus the law, possible outcomes, and finally what happens next.
All right, Section 1, Case Status and Dispute. We're going to look at what's firmly established and what's actively being contested.
To ground us in where things currently stand for these July 2026 proceedings, it's important to remember that Lindsay Clancy has pleaded not guilty and has not been convicted. She's facing 3 counts of first-degree murder for the incredibly tragic deaths of her 3 children, Cora, Dawson, and Callan. In response to these charges, her defense team is asserting a lack of criminal responsibility due to mental illness.
Now here's a really critical distinction we need to make right off the bat, and it's all about what's conceded versus what's contested. The defense is actually making a major concession here. They do not dispute causation. They are not arguing that she didn't cause the deaths. Instead, the entire trial, the absolute core dispute, centers solely on her legal criminal responsibility at the exact time of the acts.
Moving right along to Section 2, the legal test and burden, specifically looking at the Massachusetts standard.
A major question people always have in cases like this is, well, who actually has the burden of proof? Under Massachusetts law, it is the Commonwealth, the prosecution, that must prove criminal responsibility, and they have to do it beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense absolutely does not have to prove a lack of criminal responsibility. That burden rests entirely 100% on the state.
So what does the state actually have to prove? Massachusetts relies on a 2-pronged test, and this is exactly what the jury will be looking at. They have to decide if a mental disease or defect left Lindsay Clancy without substantial capacity in either of 2 very specific areas. Step 1 asks, did she lack the substantial capacity to appreciate the criminality or wrongfulness of her conduct? Step 2 asks, did she lack the substantial capacity to conform her conduct to the requirements of the law? If the jury finds she lacked substantial capacity in either one of those 2 areas because of a mental disease or defect, she is legally not criminally responsible.
Let's look at Section 3, Interpreting the Evidence, specifically how the exact same facts lead to totally different arguments.
You might be wondering, how can both sides look at the exact same pieces of evidence and walk away with entirely different legal arguments? It's simply because raw facts don't automatically answer the legal question for us. Take Patrick Clancy's testimony, for instance. He testified about his wife's mental health decline, changes in her medication, and the specific timeline of events that day. Jurors were also shown a handwritten medication journal. Now, both the prosecution and the defense agree that these pieces of evidence exist, but they draw completely opposing inferences from them. This perfectly illustrates the divide in the courtroom. The prosecution is looking at details like the specific timing of errands and certain online searches to argue that the acts were calculated, organized, and deliberately planned out. But then, the defense takes that exact same timeline, that same medication journal, and those exact same searches, and they argue it shows something else entirely. They say it shows a woman in a state of severe mental deterioration, experiencing desperate confusion, and attempting to seek help for an illness that ultimately impaired her control and capacity.
Which brings us to Section 4, Medical Context versus the Law. This is all about separating a clinical diagnosis from a legal verdict.
To really grasp the defense's arguments here, we need to talk briefly about postpartum psychosis. Medically speaking, this is classified as a rare psychiatric emergency. Symptoms can hit fast and can include delusions, hallucinations, extreme paranoia, and severe mood changes. It requires urgent, immediate psychiatric assessment. Now, recovery is absolutely possible with proper professional treatment. It's also incredibly important to highlight that the vast majority of people who experience postpartum psychosis never become violent. So a natural question is, does postpartum psychosis automatically create a legal defense? The direct answer is no, it doesn't. A clinical diagnosis, or even a documented history of severe symptoms, is absolutely relevant evidence. But by itself, it does not automatically establish or defeat criminal responsibility under the strict letter of the law.
There's a massive, firm boundary between the science and the law in this courtroom. Think of it this way. First, you have the medical question. What condition was present and how severe was it? That question is answered by clinicians and medical experts. But then you have the legal question. Did that illness remove substantial capacity to appreciate wrongfulness or conform conduct? Only the jury can answer that. The experts can offer medical opinions on her state of mind all day long, but they do not deliver the final verdict.
All right, Section 5, Possible Outcomes. Let's break down what the potential verdicts actually mean.
Based on the legal framework we just discussed, here are the potential verdicts. First, we have guilty. This would mean the jury found the Commonwealth successfully proved both the charged offense and criminal responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt. Second, not criminally responsible. This means the jury found the Commonwealth failed to prove criminal responsibility. And third, there's the possibility of lesser or mixed verdicts, but that depends entirely on the specific instructions the judge ultimately gives to the jury for the different counts.
I want to clear up a very common misconception here. What actually happens if someone is found not criminally responsible? It absolutely does not mean immediate, unsupervised freedom. In Massachusetts, a finding of not criminally responsible leads directly to court-supervised mental health evaluations and formal commitment proceedings. It's a highly regulated, medically supervised legal pathway. It is not a simple release out the front doors of the courthouse.
Finally, Section 6. What happens next? Let's look at the upcoming steps in the trial.
Here is the sequence of events you can expect as this case moves forward. First, the court is going to continue navigating evidentiary rulings and hearing extensive expert testimony, which will likely take several more weeks. Following that, the prosecution and defense will deliver their closing arguments, framing up their competing interpretations of the evidence, which usually takes a couple of days. Then, the judge will spend several hours giving the jury their instructions, those final, binding legal rules they have to follow. And then, the case moves into deliberations and a verdict. As for when that verdict will come down, that timing is entirely unknown.
So, when they retreat to that deliberation room, what must the jury actually decide? Well, they aren't answering a medical question, and they certainly aren't deciding if a horrific tragedy occurred. Everyone agrees on that.
What they are doing is answering a highly specific legal question grounded in 3 core takeaways. First, they must remember the Commonwealth carries the burden of proving criminal responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt. Second, they have to recognize that medical evidence and the legal test are 2 fundamentally different things. And third, the jury, and only the jury, must decide the ultimate issue of criminal responsibility by looking at the entirety of the trial record.
Ultimately, will the jury prioritize the devastating medical reality or the strict, unyielding letters of the law? This Court Explainer was brought to you by CassianCreed.com. Visit CassianCreed.com for verified court updates and clear explanations of what judges and juries are being asked to decide.